Hello, hello. We'll get started in just a moment. Hello, thank you for joining. Yeah, we're going to give everybody a couple minutes to join us, and then we will get started. And let me see, maybe I'm having some, hopefully get us a better connection. Okay, so I think we got it. I have 12:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Esohe Galbreath, and I am founder of Esohe Solutions and a co-founder of Articulate ATL. And I am so grateful to Comfy Art, allowing me to host Comfy Talk today and take over their IG Live for just a bit. My name is Esohe Galbreath, and my background is actually finance and engineering. And when I decided to leave corporate America about 6 years ago, I was trying to figure out exactly what I would do and who it would be for. I love creatives, always have. My mother is a serial creative and entrepreneur. And at a very young age, I found myself assisting her in ways that I didn't know would turn into full-time work later. But because of that logistics and engineering background, I felt like I had a skill set that creatives could definitely use. So growing up, my mom would often ask me to assist her with her break-even points. She's a concert promoter, a store owner. She manages musicians. So in all that creativity, as well as she's a DJ as well, there were things on that left brain side that she kind of missed out on. And so I was that helpmate, probably starting at about 14 years old. Later, I married a visual artist, George Galbreath, and found that he needed the exact same things that my mom had needed. And so in deciding to leave, a friend asked me if you could continue to do what you're already doing for free. What would that be? How are you helping others? And that was in a creative space, but adding some of that left brain component. So here I am with Esohe Solutions, where we look to assist all things creative from that left brain sort of side. Through that, we have happened upon Articulate ATL as co-founders. So my husband and I, as a part of Esohe Solutions, along with our partners, Brandon Ball and Courtney Ware of Ball & Co., started Articulate ATL. I guess this is our 8th year already. And so through all of the learning and growing, I think we figured out some things around how to produce a great art show. I've had other curatorial opportunities since then, along with Articulate ATL. And so today, I'm excited to speak with you about these components of a successful art event. And I've broken them into 2 categories. They include the planning portion and then also just the mindfulness piece of things. So that's what kind of made sense to me as we broke those things apart. So hopefully throughout today's conversation, those components of planning a successful event is something that you all can take away with you and appreciate as you plan your own very successful art events. So first piece is planning. As I love all things numbers, I love a good budget. So I actually enjoy the budgeting piece of things. Consider all of the components that you're interested in having as a part of your show or event. And so there's the venue component. And for us, that is often the largest cost component of anything that we do. For the past 5 years, we've hosted the event at Mason Fine Art Gallery. This year, we actually recorded the event and we're going virtual, but we still had venue costs for where we would record that event. So once again, we leaned upon Mason Fine Arts. So figure out that piece and how much that should cost you. Early on, we were at a much smaller space because we only had 300 to 400 attendees. And so at this point, we have closer to 800 to 1,000 attendees, depending on year. but that does require a pretty large space. So contemplating the space and how many people you'd like to have. At some point, we know that Articulate might not be quite as special even in a larger venue and space, even if we could fit more people. But maybe you want to consider having that across multiple days. But venue is a huge consideration for your budget. The next piece is marketing. So how will you spend those marketing dollars? We know that now in social media, we can spend money through Facebook, advertising, Instagram. There are all of these various avenues that you can use to promote your message. And there's still Google ads and things of that sort. We also have used email blast services. So if there are email distribution lists that you would like to make sure know about your event, and you feel like they would meet the right audience, that is also another paid form of promotion. You can also pay for radio advertising, advertising space in magazines and publications. All of that should be a part of your contemplation of your budget. There are also some incidentals like supplies, and that's one of the things that you sometimes forget about because it is a smaller piece of the budget, but it's the little things that make the difference. So one of the things within the venues is that you don't necessarily want to be responsible for a lot of damage to the walls. And sometimes that takes some very special hanging equipment and being very thoughtful about that. And so making sure that you invest in those pieces so that you have them there. If you're hosting a group of artists, part of that supplies bucket might actually include food and kind of refreshments as well. While they're setting up, over the course of the event, you might want to make sure that they have something to eat, they're in great spirits, and you're appropriately hosting. So that can include supplies as well. Revenue targets. So how much and how do you propose you're going to actually make money from the event to cover these other items? So you have these costs, but as a part of your budget, you should also include revenue targets. And for us, we often contemplate, because we actually sell tickets to the in-person event, how many people do we think we can have at what ticket price points? And so we consider offering an early bird ticket price, and then what we call general admission, which is like, hey, go ahead and get your tickets now because the day of event price is going to go up and at the door is going to go up. One of the challenges that we've seen is that a lot of people wait until the day of because they don't want to initially commit. That's great, but it makes it very difficult from a planning purpose. Thankfully for us, after 8 years, we kind of recognize and know the trends and what this all looks like. And so we can make some safe assumptions around what our revenue targets can be. I typically have a baseline target, like this is what we need to happen, and then a bit of a stretch goal, right? And finally, worst case scenario. And worst case scenario typically for me revolves around a break-even point. So that break-even point is where your expenses equal your revenue. So you know that you're covered, you're not coming out of pocket necessarily to host this awesome event. But that contemplation to me, and I hate to call it worst case scenario, but we have never hosted any event, Articulate or otherwise via Esohe Solutions, that we didn't actually break even. I recognize that that's a blessing, but part of that comes in the planning. Also, figuring out scalability. So at different income levels, you're able to do different things, right? And so if you have these revenues and these ticket targets, you might also decide, well, at this particular ticket level with this many tickets sold, we only want to consider this sort of venue. Not all events, art events, are ticketed events. So recognizing that as well, and sometimes there is a percentage of the artist sales that you may contemplate receiving from the artists who are participating. Trying to figure out those parameters and what that revenue may look like would prove to be a lot more challenging for an art social like ours, which is a once-a-year event. It's a great event. The artists sell plenty of artwork. Last year, our artists sold $35,000 worth of work and kept 100% of those proceeds. But in this year's environment, we recognize that that might look a little different. And because we're not able to charge for tickets, the artists actually aren't keeping 100% of their proceeds. And so there's a nominal 15% that Articulate is receiving. Part of that simply covers just credit card processing fees, right? And then with Articulate, we have a nonprofit component specifically for youth artist programming. So while Articulate ATL is a nonprofit, so is the youth artist programming component. And so some of that revenue goes directly towards the to the program. And so in this very different virtual environment, we were left to kind of pivot and figure out some of this. Quick plug, if you are contemplating looking for something to do on Saturday night, that will be the streamed event. And so you can go to articulateatl.org or check us out on Instagram at articulateatl and get all of the details, but the event will be streamed at 7 p.m. And I'm gonna move to... Another part of the planning includes your team. As a part of our team, I contemplate the artists. The artists are a huge part of what we do. Without the artists, there would be no Articulate ATL. And so making sure that those artists work well together, that you're able to work well with them, because we all have various personality types. Artists most certainly have different personality types. And so it's just important to have that contemplation and also to recognize that these artists are indeed a part of your team. Your team is the components that are necessary to make this thing successful, right? And so in contemplating who your team may be, it could include artists, but also for us, there's a production portion of the team. And so that production also includes the DJs that we incorporate, the caterers who may be providing the food, even down to the mixologists, because we want to make sure that everybody is having a wonderful experience once there. And also just the 4 planners, right? So that's me and my husband, and then also Brandon and Courtney, and we all kind of have our roles within that team. But as a part of your planning, it's important to identify the various people that you need in order to make this event a success. As you're contemplating that, I'm a lover of lists and writing things down, so that's a part of that planning as well. For us, as we're trying to gather our artists, we've always hoped for Articulate to be a really inclusive event for local and emerging artists. And so there's always an open artist call. We can say that it's a blind selection process, but over time you start to recognize certain artists' work. So it can be a little difficult to be completely blind, but we are open to new and emerging talent. And a few years ago, just recognizing that some artists were looking to participate year over year and they were wonderful and they were great, we made a consideration that we wanted at least 30% of the selected artists to be new artists. And so those 30% means they hadn't shown and Articulate before. And I think that that keeps things fresh for our audience and even fresh for us as event planners. So that's part of that planning and thought process as it relates to the artists who were included. Lastly, the timeline. So the scheduling, thinking about all the things that need to happen to make this event successful. I often start with the end date and then try and work backwards. And we as a team, we've thought of the various components. You've thought of the team, you've thought of the budget, but how do I make all of this work and make sure that it happens timely? Most certainly, where does marketing fit into that scheduling timeline? This year with Articulate going virtual, we recognized that while we wanted Articulate on people's minds, also in this virtual space with so much content being online, we didn't want that to happen too early. So we wanted it out there, but our planning and timeline as it related specifically to marketing changed up a bit this year. Communications. Those communications, of course, include those outward communications to your potential audience, but also internal communications amongst the team. So how often will your team meet? At what time do you need to be able to make contact with them? And then keeping the artist informed throughout the process as best as you can. And so that communication may happen in person. For our artist call, we typically have an artist informational, just so artists know what to expect throughout the application process. Post the artist informational, we also look to host a meet and greet amongst the artists who are participating, and then just having follow-up email communication, so hopefully none of the artists are terribly confused about what's happening and when. But again, I think the communications are really important for the considerations as to who's a part of your team. So if those artists are a huge part of your team and they're a necessary portion of your success, then you should most certainly be communicating with them as often as possible. Next up is contracts. And contracts, it actually has a little piece of budgeting associated with it as well. But with the contracts portion, there are certain contracts that are due early on. There may be a deposit required to secure the date for the venue. and then any other contracts that you may have with DJs or caterers or other vendors and what they may charge in order to secure that date for hosting your event. And then lastly, the curation of the show. Throughout all of this planning, we don't want to forget that very creative portion that's necessary, and that's actually thinking about how the show goes, what it looks like, and all of the components that you hope to include for a successful show. There's sometimes things that you think of and you realize that you simply ran out of time because you didn't have the opportunity to include those items. One of the big things for us is actually the label piece. And so at one point in time, my husband started calling me the label fairy because I'd have other art shows and curators that I'm familiar with who may say, hey, can you run these labels for me? But I think making sure that people are able to identify price points, how much this artwork costs, who the artist is, especially in a group show, having some connection with a piece of art, with the name of the art, the medium that is used that may not be readily apparent to the viewer of the artwork. So that is a portion of that curation and that planning that's important to us. Now, after all the planning, just being mindful and making sure you incorporate mindfulness into this very successful art show that you're planning. So part of that mindfulness is your why. Why are you doing this thing? What do you hope to convey? For Articulate, it was important for us to provide this clean, amazing space for emerging artists. So we often saw really great art shows with more established artists, and the space was clean and the presentation was clean. But then when it came to our more emerging artists, if there was some sort of art party component, sometimes the art would get lost, and it was just meant to serve as a really pretty backdrop. And pretty backdrops are nice, but if it's supposed to be about the artist, then let's make it about the artist. So for us, it was providing emerging artists with a clean space to showcase their work, but also connecting them with emerging collectors. And so making that message really simple and direct. You can buy art, and we want you to buy art because we want you to be able to support artists. And so that ability to support artists and support what they're doing and why they're doing it is really important. And so when you're planning out any event, art related or otherwise, to be mindful of your why and why you're doing it. And so as sometimes there's some difficult decisions to be made or you have some choices to make, it's always great to be able to go back to your why. So when you're able to go back to that why, it makes the decision-making process a little easier. Even more so when you're working in a team. There are 4 of us, and sometimes we have very divergent opinions and thoughts about how things should be. But I think if we keep our why and the mission for the event kind of at center and at focus, those debates or where people may differ from a personality perspective in their thoughts, you're able to come together because you have this cohesive thought as to your why in mind. Next is your lane. So it's a stay in your lane kind of thing. Recognize where your strengths exist and where the strengths of your team members exist. And so if you're responsible for curating of the show and the look and feel of the show, make sure that you're spending your time and energy there. If you're responsible for the budget, then your time and energy should be spent there. Sometimes we overstep and we want to dip into other people's spaces, but it's important to be thoughtful and mindful about your particular why. Additionally, just as you're planning for an art show, if it's a group show, the roles are a little different. But if you have a solo show, or maybe it's just a show with only a couple of artists, then that becomes a different thought process. And so sometimes within a space, I've curated an art show where it was the seller in the space was different than me as the curator, was different than the person who was the artist. So just recognizing that we all have our roles and our responsibilities, and if every team member looks to excel in what their role and responsibility is, it makes for a really dynamic and awesome show. If we get a little confused and we start stepping over one another, then that could make for some difficulties. Mindfulness about the artist. I spoke to it a little bit before, but when we're doing our artist call, we are, especially when we start to narrow it down a bit, we are thoughtful about personalities. especially if an artist has participated before. So we've had shows where an artist had a really strong personality and possibly went outside of their wall space. Well, that was difficult for the artist that was next to them. So even if that artist participates again, you might be thoughtful and say, hey, I'm going to have these two stronger personalities together within that same space so one artist doesn't dominate the other. We're mindful about the space. So having 30 to 35 artists in a show, there's a lot more that goes into placement of the artist than simply where the artist is located. If this artist is a photographer and you want them next to a painter, like that's great and that's easy, but you also want to think about those personalities. And cohesiveness of work. So this can be for the entirety of the show, or it can be for a section of kind of how the work is displayed, but you don't want things that are too terribly jarring. And at the same time, you don't necessarily want work from different artists that would confuse the viewer because they look too similar. And so we look for clean separation in a group show between the difference in the work. Also, cohesiveness of work just with the particular artist. Having work that is too varied where the viewer looking at the work may have difficulty in identifying that it's all the same work from the same artist is a tough one. So we look to make sure that that work looks good together and you can look at it. And it doesn't have to be of the same color palette or anything of that sort, but you recognize and can see that artist's voice within the work. This year, it was really interesting, and it probably just has a lot to do with the times we're in, but several of our artists were really into the figure of the Black woman. And so we saw it over and over again. And as the interviews were being conducted for the streaming event, artists were speaking to the beauty of the Black woman. While our artist call is open to all, we tend to have a heavier concentration, artists of color. Again, this is emerging artists in the city of Atlanta and it's open. But this year's work was very Black, if that makes any sense. And so to see that work come together in the space was a really beautiful thing, and hopefully that is conveyed via the stream as well. Lastly, craftsmanship is a big one too. So there's some artists who present their work in a rougher format. I've seen exhibits where it was all pinned up and it was great work and it was displayed wonderfully, but that looks different than if everything is framed. Those frames can be very simple or they could be very ornate, but just thinking of the craftsmanship and where the artist is in the work. I'm a big stickler for making sure you paint your edges. And so if you don't frame your canvases and the canvases are of a certain depth, it makes sense that you may not actually put them inside of a frame, but to have a finished, complete look would include the framing of the canvas. Also goes back to the hanging equipment and how you hang your work. But when artists are participating in a group show, you don't want the weaknesses of any one particular artist to bring down the other artists who are included within the show. So you're hoping that the artists elevate one another and all somewhat rise to the occasion. Moving on to your clients. So be very mindful of who your clients are, and you have to think about who your clients are. For Articulate in particular, our clients include our artist. We are doing this for the artist, and so we hope that the artist has a wonderful experience. If we come out of Articulate and all of our attendees had a great time, that's good, but it's not great because the artists didn't also enjoy themselves. So you want to make sure that you are thinking about who your clients are. And for us, it includes the artists, it includes the attendees, and it includes our sponsors. And so if you have an event and you've included your sponsors, you need to consider them as clients throughout. That may actually be them physically in the space. It may be the marketing leading up to the event, but being thoughtful about those who support your event and who provide the components to make it a successful event. The attendees, making sure they have a good time. We're thinking about them throughout. That even goes to just simply being able to find where the event is located, coming into the event space, not having to spend a lot of time in line. Years ago, we used to offer a VIP ticket price, which included light bites. And a few years ago, we decided everybody should have light bites, right? Like, why should there be any difference? We want everybody to have a great time. And if we're offering complimentary cocktails, it's only responsible that we probably also have some food in the space as well. when we're contemplating our artists and the artist pricing, if our attendees and who we're hoping to attract includes emerging collectors, we want to be thoughtful about and mindful about the work being something that can be afforded and can be within their budget and their spend. And so when we're working with the artist selection includes where those artists are. And so we say emerging artists, but it's not just for the sake of providing an opportunity to those who may not have it, but it's also so that they pair up and marry up well who we hope our attendees to be. Okay, being mindful about other art events for a few different reasons. We want to contemplate date overlaps. In a city as large as Atlanta, sometimes there's several art events going on. And because there are 6 million people, it's not just, oh, there are plenty of people who are still going to come to your art event. I don't think it's fair to make people choose, right? And so in a space where there's a lot of awesome activity going on, to be thoughtful about these other art events and when they may occur, so that you're leaving space for people not to have to make what could be a difficult decision if you're just thoughtful and mindful about your planning. Also, the possibility that artists might want to participate in both. So we've seen some overlap of the same artist, and we don't want the artists to also have to choose. We want there to be enough opportunities for artists to promote and sell their work in spaces that they deem appropriate. And so being mindful of the dates is also about that. So again, while we have a huge marketplace in Atlanta, and we have not found it especially difficult, and we've been blessed to be able to gather nearly 1,000 people in the same space to enjoy this work, we don't want that to be at the expense of another art event that could have been success and overall added something to our culture and space. Also, crossover, being mindful of the potential for crossover of the clients and attendees and the artists. So one of the cool things has been being able to go to other art events and to look at it through the lens of a curator and think about how that experience was great and what made you want to come back and made you want for more, and also thinking about ways in which you could have done things possibly differently. So it's been one of, I think, the most pleasurable parts of our work is to be able to go to various art events, check them out, seeing what they're doing, and seeing how what they're doing and how they're doing it could possibly cross over to the event that you're having. We're also constantly being introduced to new artists as well, and hoping that those artists might submit for Articulate later. And lastly, being mindful of your finances. So the finance piece is still a huge one. We talked about it from a budget perspective, but in mindfulness, always contemplating the spend and what you hope to get out of it. For some of us, simply investing in this activity would be enough to fill our hearts. And that's what we've decided we wanted to do. We want to invest here. But in other ways, depending on how your budget is set up, you might need to be mindful that you need to break even. This is not something that you can go into the red on. And if you're using your own money and your own resources to host this event, you don't want the monetary piece to be such a huge stressor that it takes away from you doing it to the best of your ability. So when we think about our why and kind of our lane, what we're doing and why we're doing it, finances should be a part of that. If you're looking to host this event or to promote this event because you're hoping to have a financial gain from it, it's great. But then everything that you do needs to be to that end. I think having a solid why is important, and the genuineness of your efforts will show through for your artists and for your attendees. So with that, I am so excited that I've been able to conclude my first mini masterclass. I hope that everyone who joined was able to learn something. But if you have some additional questions or want to reach out, this is my contact information. So on IG, I am Esohe Galbreath. We also are Esohe Solutions, and that includes currently my husband and I working as a team to do all things in support of the creatives. And last but certainly not least, Articulate ATL. So the event is this Saturday at 7 p.m. and it can be streamed at articulateatl.org. But if you want more information and to stay tuned, and also just to be aware of future artist calls and opportunities, that is most certainly where you can see it. Email address is listed, info@sohesolutions.com. And again, the website address for this Saturday's live stream event, with all of the wonderful emerging artists in Atlanta that we could find and who were gracious enough to be a part of this event. There are 20 awesome artists featured, and I hope that you will all join us and be a part of that. But thank you again so much to Deanna and Comfy Art for providing me the space for the Comfy Talk today, and I hope that you all got something from it.